Okay, so we're live now. We're going to talk about basically, we'll see how much discussion we can get out of this, but for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, we'll see how long it goes. I'd like to discuss the issue of civil disobedience, or whether or not civil disobedience is enough, or whether uncivil disobedience is necessary. And then I guess because it's an ethics course, which of the two is ever ethically justified, if either one, right? Is it ever ethically justified to disobey, I guess the authorities, whoever's in power, whatever the laws are? Is it ever okay to do that? And is it ever okay to use violence in order to bring about social, political change? These are the questions that we're going to be examining through the works of Simone de Beauvoir, Malcolm X, and MLK. But so I don't know. I'm trying to maybe keep this within the theme of the course. Most of you here are not taking the course that I'm recording this for. Andrea is the only student from Oregon who's here. So she's probably the only one that would have the answer to this, maybe. But who would probably be the one philosopher who we covered this semester would definitely say no to almost every one of those questions that I just asked, right? Is it ever okay to break the law? No. Is it ever okay to challenge authority with violence? No. Out of all the philosophers we covered, who do you think the one that stands out most, that this is like an anathema to their philosophy? Any guesses, Andrea? Or hate to put you on the spot. Actually, I guess it's kind of a trick question. Most of them would, but there's one that kind of jumps out at me. What do you have in mind?
The ones that we've talked about?
Right. So we covered, so just to list them briefly, right? We started with Plato. We didn't really cover him that much. So, the idea of the forms, there are these perfect ideals and all values are based on them. And then we had Aristotle, the virtue ethicist, and ethics is a matter of developing good virtues and, fulfilling one's goals and one's ends. And on a societal level, that sort of still holds. There's a telos of society. And then
what about Kantian ethics?
Well, yeah, I think for sure. Yeah, that's a good guess. That's not who I was thinking, but for sure, I think Kant would be one that would come to mind, because he's always like, always have to follow the rules. You can't break the rules, for some aim. Just because you think society would be better if you broke the law, that doesn't justify you doing it, right? So I would see why you would say Kant, but I was thinking Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, because remember, yeah, for Thomas Hobbes, there really is no right or wrong in nature. There's no justice or injustice in nature. In a state of nature, for instance, it's not unjust for a lion to kill a zebra because there's no social contract. They're just in nature, and the lion's hungry and the zebra can't run as fast or whatever. And that's just the way it is. But once humans and living beings, or whatever, I guess humans are the only ones that do this on this planet. Once humans organize in society, and we sort of always seem to have done this, we have some sort of social cohesion. There are social rules that one follows, and this is part of a social contract. So I suspect that Hobbes would have nothing to do with any of these three: Simone de Beauvoir, Malcolm X, or MLK. Although I've never read his book Behemoth, which is, I'm not embarrassed to say I've never read it, because most people haven't. Most people have read The Leviathan. That's his most famous work. But apparently in the Behemoth, it's a companion piece to the Leviathan. Leviathan is a very authoritarian type of philosophy. Government has to have all this power to keep us safe. It almost endorses a sort of oppressive regime in the interest of security and prosperity. But the Behemoth, his other work, apparently lays out the conditions under which it's okay to rebel. I guess he does mention some exceptions in Leviathan. Hobbes talks about how if, the only reason that you are a part of the social contract, the only reason that you follow the rules is because it's really to your own advantage. It's sort of this egotism, right? I'm a good person because it's good for me to be good. It actually benefits me. But the minute that I'm in danger, if the king or whoever the ruling elite are, if they can't protect me, or if they persecute me, then the contract is null and void. And then I'm sort of free to do whatever I want. But that's the only exception that I can remember from Leviathan. So I think Behemoth talks about when it's okay for actually rebellion to occur, when a government has ceased to be legitimate and needs to be replaced. For Simone de Beauvoir, to try to get to the topic for today, it seems like for her, the justification for revolt, as she calls it, when we revolt against the people in power, the justification for this is oppression. And this is where I think some of the other students, even if you haven't taken my ethics class in Oregon, you might, because we have covered existentialism. This is where you guys might chime in and you might kind of be able to follow a little bit of this. For the existentialist, freedom is sort of the basis for all values. Sartre says this at the end of Existentialism as a Humanism. Sartre says that there is one value that the existentialist recognizes, and in fact, he kind of implies that we all tacitly recognize it. We all recognize the importance of freedom, and what he has in mind by that word, what is freedom for him? The ability to engage in a project of my own design, to engage in goals that I set for myself, to use Simone de Beauvoir's language, to make myself a lack of being, and to try to fill that lack by pursuing goals and interests. And so freedom is what allows me to do this. My freedom is what gives me the ability to do this. And so if I didn't have my freedom, I wouldn't have a basis for any values. Right? It's when I make myself a lack of being, I lack being a doctor. Now I know I need to go to medical school. I need to learn this or that trade. There's a set of obligations that I've set for myself. Without doing that first step of making myself a lack of being, their argument is that the world would be without value. We'd have no values. And since we all value something, we all care about something. We might, maybe there's some people out there that don't care about anything but sports, or they don't care about anything but their dog or their cat or whatever. But at the bottom, we all care about something. And the existentialists are going to argue that our freedom is what allows us to have that care, that concern, to choose that care and that concern and act on it. So I have to value freedom if I value anything. It's sort of like if I don't, I'm being dishonest. It's a de facto value. If I care about anything, got to care about freedom. And what follows from that, and I don't think Sartre is very good at convincing us of this, but he thinks that what follows from that is that I should care about the freedom of others. I should be concerned about their freedom. And I think she actually does a much stronger job of explaining this. Why should I care about the other freedom? Well, she thinks that the other freedom will make me more free. The more free they are, the more free I am. In fact, let me try to find, there's a passage from the reading from chapter 3 of the Ethics of Ambiguity from the Simone de Beauvoir reading, where she talks about, why should I care? And why do I have an obligation to free those who are oppressed, right? So here's her sort of, I guess, her justification for revolt. When is it okay to revolt and maybe even use violence if necessary in this process? So let's see here. Where's the page I'm looking for? Well, there are this is on page 86. There are a series of arguments that she considers in this chapter that are all from some imagined oppressor, right? Somebody who doesn't quite buy into this argument for why should I care about other freedom, right? Or maybe other freedom does matter, but other things matter even more. And so one of these arguments, this is on page 86, is the oppressor saying, well, it's none of your business, right? You got your freedom. Why should you care about the slave or the woman in the patriarchal society? Or why should you care about their freedom? It's not your concern. And here's her sort of reply. It's about a third of the way down on page 86. She says, and this is in quotation marks, so she's parroting the oppressor. What right does one have to want something for others? Asks the conservative. Oh, that's right, I forget. There's several different arguments from the oppressor, and some of them are from what she labels the conservative oppressor, but there's also the progressive oppressor as well. So sometimes oppression is, and what does she mean by oppression? It's when somebody's cut off from any positive uses of their freedom. And we'll talk more about those positive uses. We were supposed to talk about them on Friday, but nobody showed up. We'll talk about those positive uses of freedom next meeting. Hopefully some of y'all can make it for that. I think, Desiree, in class on Wednesday, we talked about those indefinite conquests of existence over being. But again, I kind of got sidetracked here. The conservative oppressor typically argues that, well, something has to be conserved. The reason these people are oppressed is there's a good reason. It's to hold society up, or something like this, or it's for tradition, or there's all sorts of justifications used in order to justify oppression. Some of them are conservative, others are progressive. She does later in the chapter talk about how some people we have to exploit these people. They have to be oppressed in order for progress to occur. I guess like the imperial colonialists exploiting the natives of some tribe. It's okay because we're using their resources. It's in the name of progress, this sort of thing. And throughout the chapter, I don't think we have time to cover every single argument. They're in the lectures I posted. So if you're interested, you can listen to those lectures, those students of mine at Oregon. But she goes through all of these and sort of opposes them all. But this one that I'm about to read, before I got sidetracked, this is where, she kind of spells out why I not only am justified in caring about the other's freedom, but I'm also sort of morally obligated to, in a certain sense. So let's start at the beginning there. What right does one have to want something for others, asks the conservative, who meanwhile regards the working man or the native as a grown-up child, and who does not hesitate to dispose of the child's will. Indeed, there's nothing more arbitrary than intervening as a stranger in a destiny which is not ours. So in a certain sense, she's like, we've got a point, right? You don't, if somebody's living their life and engaging in the world in a way you don't approve of, that's none of your business. But that's not what's going on here. That's not the situation. Skipping forward a bit, she says, the cause of freedom is not that of others. Let me start that over. The cause of freedom is not that of others more than it is mine. It is universally human. Okay. So when I tell the slave owner, stop being a slave owner, free your slaves, he can't really tell me, well, hey, if the slave didn't want to be a slave, he would stand up for himself. What right do you have to want freedom for him? Well, that's not the point, right? I want him to be able to make choices for himself, right? Freedom is a universal value. And again, I want the slave to be free. If I want him to be conscious of his servitude, she writes, it is both in order not to be a tyrant myself, for any abstention is complicity, and complicity in this case is tyranny, and in order that new possibilities might be opened up to the liberated slave, and through him to all men. To want existence, to want to disclose a world, and to want men to be free are one and the same will. Okay, so what is she saying here? There's sort of two reasons she's giving for why I intervene and why I want to liberate the slave or the working man or the native who's being exploited. Why? Well, one, if I don't, I'm just as guilty. That's a pretty bold claim. Sartre wrote that I'm guilty for the war, even if I'm not in the war, even if I didn't declare the war, I'm guilty for the war, unless I'm protesting against it, unless I'm doing all I can. I can say that I care about certain things, I have certain opinions, but that's all just small talk for him and for the existentialist. My actions are what really determine or reveal my values. So I can bitch about the war and how unjust it is, but am I doing anything about it? It must not matter that much for me. So she's kind of saying here that if I don't stop the slave owner from owning the slave, or try as best I can to do that, I might as well own the slave myself. I think that's a bit extreme, but I think she does have a point. I don't know if you're just as bad as the slave owner, but you're definitely not a great person. If you're walking by on the street, let's say, and you see somebody being victimized or beaten up or, whatever, and you're just like, hey, what's up, man? That looks like you're in a lot of trouble there. I hope you get away. I hope you get safe. See you later, dude. I mean, right? You walk by some woman and she's getting raped, and you're just like, oh, that's horrible. I wish he would stop. I hope you get away. I hope he stops. Bye. Right? Like, I don't know if you're just as bad as the rapist, but like that's pretty lousy. That's pretty lame. Like, so I think that's kind of the point she's making. Well, I think she's making even a stronger point. She's saying that you might as well be the oppressor. You might as well be the victimizer if you don't stop it. So that's one reason. If I allow this oppression to continue, then I'm tacitly sort of approving of it. I'm sort of tacitly saying, well, it doesn't bother me that much, right? And so for her, I can't stand by and let that happen if I truly do care about freedom, as she obviously does. So that's one reason. The second reason is that not only will the slave be free, but through him, other possibilities will be opened up to all men. Again, the more free the slave is, the more free I am. It's not quite obvious how that works, but Desiree might know because we talked about this in class on Wednesday in my intro to philosophy class when we were kind of finishing up our unit on existentialism and Sartre. But just briefly, I'll explain it. And we'll talk about this more next week when we do we do one more meeting on Simone, just on Simone by herself, and we talk about positive uses of freedom and things like cultural appropriation and where we get our identity from in a positive sense. So I'll expand on it there, but I want to at least give some example for those of you who weren't here in my class on Wednesday or aren't going to be here next time. The idea that through the slave, the freed slave, once he or she is free, that slave will open up possibilities for all mankind. It's pretty obvious that once the slave is free, there'll be more possibilities for the slave now that they're no longer a slave. But how do they open up new possibilities for me? Well, again, these positive uses of our freedom, she mentions at the beginning of the chapter: technology, art, philosophy. What's the other one? Science. If I let a group that has been sort of segregated and excluded from those positive activities, if I let a group in to the dialogue, she thinks that's always going to be a net positive. The more perspectives that you allow at the table, the more rich your tradition will be, your science, your art, your philosophy. The more you let in. I gave examples in class, and I don't want to get too much into this because I want to save it for when we talk about de Beauvoir, probably next Saturday, I'm guessing. But I use the example of Louis Armstrong, right, the jazz musician, and how he expanded the vocal range of popular music, and you couldn't have had blues or rock and roll without him, and also how he expanded the range of the trumpet. And this is just one example, right? And I think it's a good example for me because it's something that only I think somebody who had lived in that culture could have brought to the table. I think that he was a unique musician. He was able to influence Western music, but yet he had roots outside of it because of, I think that blues, R&B, soul music had developed independently of sort of the mainstream, I guess, white music, for lack of a better word. The sort of the Negro spirituals that were sung during the slave days, the polyrhythms that they were using in jazz were kind of alien to Western music. So I think that, again, a group that has been sort of ignored, excluded, marginalized, once they're allowed to be a part of the greater dialogue, it's going to benefit everybody, right? And they're going to bring something to the table that maybe I never thought of playing the trumpet that way. Wow, that sounds, that's crazy, but it works. I'm going to try that myself and maybe add my own style, my own flair to it, And so this dialogue is something that she's going to argue benefits us all. So the more people, again, that we bring to the table. So that's why, for her, we're justified to revolt. This is why it's okay to even be violent. And this is sort of the argument, well, wait a minute. If you care about freedom, What about my freedom, says the oppressor? What about my freedom to be oppressive? What about my freedom to own slaves? She thinks that's a horrible argument. She says it's a inconsistent argument. When I say I want freedom, what I mean is I want people to be open to possibilities, not I want them to be free to shut others off from their possibilities. Right? How does she put it here? Is like, I'm oppressed if I'm thrown in prison. I'm not oppressed if I'm not allowed to throw anybody I want in prison just because I don't like them or I don't like what they say, right? You know, you took away my right to enslave people. It's like, well, for her, and this is what she kind of means by the antinomies of action. That phrase that I put in the comments of this meeting, right? What we're discussing, the antinomies of action, right? The word antinomy, it means a contradiction. It means, you know, to be real technical, it's a pair of arguments, two arguments that are antithetical, but they're supposed to be both good arguments. They're both valid, they're both sound, but they both contradict. They have contradictory conclusions. That's a more abstract understanding of an antinomy. When she talks about the antinomies of action, she says there's a sort of antinomy when we act, when we engage in the world, and we try to expand freedom and bring as much freedom to as many people as possible. Well, what's the antinomy? The antinomy is that we, in order to affirm freedom and in order to expand freedom, we have to deny freedom. That's the contradiction. Not all freedom, but we have to deny the freedom of the oppressor to oppress. And sometimes we have to even deny ourselves some of our own freedom, at least temporarily. You know, there's a passage where she talks about this. Let me find the passage. This is on 89, and she's talking about Richard Wright, who he's a novelist who was a part of the Harlem Renaissance. He's a black man who was also considered a bit of an existentialist. If you read some of his novels, they're considered existential fiction, many of them. But Richard Wright, during World War II, refused to serve because he disapproved of the segregated army. He said, I'm not going to serve some army that segregates me and treats me as a different from a white soldier. And she sort of, when she mentions him as an example, I don't think she disagrees with them. She says, you know, if that's what he strongly believes in, I support his view. But I think the point she's trying to make is that occasionally you might have to kind of suck it up and accept things that you don't really like, and maybe even and kind of like maybe take a little bit of a compromise, at least temporarily, when you're in a situation that requires it. And I think what she has in mind here is probably her own situation during the war under the Nazi occupation, right? When the Nazis took over large parts of France, there was a limiting of freedom. She wanted to be a part of the resistance. Her and Sartre both tried their best to help in the resistance, but you know, they had to lie, they had to pretend, they had to maybe tell some of the Nazi occupiers things that they were insincere about. And so they had to sacrifice their freedom temporarily in order to win back their country and to liberate, or something like this. This might be an example. I'm thinking myself of like coronavirus right now. I hate to use that as an example because I honestly, just to sort of put my cards on the table, I think we overreacted, and I think that we just overdid it with the lockdowns and stuff. But this is the kind of, I think, reasoning somebody could use to support the lockdowns and mask mandates. They would say, well, yes, it sucks. We do want freedom, but this is like a temporary inconvenience, right? I think Arnold Schwarzenegger got in a bunch of trouble a few weeks ago because he posted some video where he's like, screw your freedoms. You know, he was like talking about wearing masks, and he said, screw your freedoms. But that soundbite was kind of taken out of context. He was kind of making the same point, I think, that she's trying to make in this passage I'm about to read. It's not screw your freedoms, just freedoms are important, but maybe occasionally you have to sort of sacrifice, at least temporarily, until we get safe, right? So if the tanks are rolling over the hill and Hitler is invading, you know, she agrees with Richard Wright. She doesn't think the army should be segregated. She doesn't believe in this racist segregation system. She hates it, but there's tanks about to blow up our city. Can we argue about this later while we're not being bombarded by tanks? So I think that's kind of her point, and that's where it comes up. This is also a part of the antinomies, right? That not only do we have to deny the oppressor their freedom to oppress, but sometimes we have to sacrifice our own freedom, if only temporarily, for this cause of the greater freedom of all. So let me read that passage real quick, and then we'll move on. Again, this is on page 89 if you have the reading. It's about halfway down. She says, it's possible that he may be led to sacrifice temporarily a cause whose success is subordinate to that of a cause whose defense is more urgent. On the other hand, it's possible that one may judge it necessary to maintain the tension of revolt against the situation to which one does not wish to consent at any price. Thus, during the war, when Negro leaders in America were asked to drop their own claims for the sake of the general interest, Richard Wright refused. And so she seemed to be supporting him. She's like, you know, sometimes it's that important. And if he doesn't want to fight, then I can respect that decision. You know, he thought that even in a time of war, his cause had to be defended. But in any case, morality requires that the combatant be not blinded by the goal which he sets up for himself to the point of falling into the fanaticism of seriousness or passion. We already talked about the serious man and the passionate man in previous videos, so I won't go into that. The cause which he serves must not lock itself up and thus create a new element of separation. Through his own struggle, he must seek to serve the universal cause of freedom, right? And I'm trying to find, there's a passage here, and this is where this will be a nice transition to Malcolm X and MLK, because I think this is something that Malcolm X would be on board with, and I don't really know, I don't think MLK would. So let's read, this is on page 98. It's pretty close to the beginning of that section called The Antinomies of Action. And she mentions this case of a Nazi youth who was killed, this 16-year-old, I think, or 17, I forget. I'll read the passage in a second here. But this kid gets killed. And she says, this is tragic. This is sad, right? Because not only, you know, when we fight this struggle, it's not just the oppressor whose freedom we have to deny. Sometimes it's innocent people. You know, we would like to stop and maybe capture this kid and explain to him how he's been brainwashed since he was a kid to be racist and hate Jewish people or whatever, love his homeland, like some religious zealot. We would love to do that. But when there's bullets flying, we don't have the time. And so unfortunately, these are sort of, I hate to use the term because I've always hated this term. This is sort of collateral damage, to use a military expression. It's sad, but it's necessary. And she says, yeah, so we have to sort of sacrifice these individuals. They've been brainwashed. They've been led to believe in Hitler's evil, and they're marching into the battlefield to fight. And, you know, unfortunately, they got guns pointed at us. They're shooting at us, and we got to shoot back. And this is ugly, but this is the way it works for her, right? So she's, again, kind of with Malcolm X, right? This has to be done. It's unfortunate, but by any means necessary, we've got to trudge through. So she says the oppressor, this is the very top of page 98, the oppressor would not be so strong if he did not have accomplices amongst the oppressed themselves. Mystification, kind of what like being brainwashed, right? Mystification is one of the forms of oppression. Ignorance is a situation in which man may be enclosed as narrowly as in a prison. As we have already said, every individual may practice his freedom inside his world, but not everyone has the means of rejecting, even by doubt, the values, taboos, and prescriptions by which he is surrounded. Doubtless, respectful minds take the object of their respect for their own, and in this sense, they are responsible for it, as they are responsible for their presence in the world, but they are not guilty if their adhesion is not a resignation of their freedom. When a young 16-year-old Nazi died crying Heil Hitler, he was not guilty, and it was not he whom we hated, but his masters. The desirable thing would be to re-educate this misled youth. It would be necessary to expose the mystification and put the men who are its victims in the presence of their freedom. But the urgency of the struggle forbids this slow labor. We are obliged to destroy not only the oppressor, but also those who serve him. whether they do so out of ignorance or out of constraint, right? So again, the sort of the higher cause of ultimately expanding freedom as much as possible and ending oppression is not a pretty struggle, right? It's not pretty. You can't just target the oppressor, because obviously, we talked about this in class when we were talking about, actually, I don't know if we did cover this in class. I think we might have, Desiree, in my intro class, we were talking about, even if you're a tyrant, how you are somewhat a servant, that there's a sort of a supreme servitude of tyranny, right? Because the tyrant has to have underlings. He has to have people supporting him, right? Saddam Hussein didn't just march into Baghdad one day and said, "Hey, I saw your Craigslist ad for a dictator. I think I'm perfectly suited for that. Please hire me. I'm ruthless and willing to kill and backstab people. Oh, you're hired, Saddam. Please rule over us and be a brutal dictator." No, he worked his way up some hierarchy. He convinced some people that letting him be the leader was to their advantage. He had some infrastructure to hold him up. And so, unfortunately, when we try to liberate those who are oppressed, some of them don't know that they are being brainwashed, and they think, again, that these oppressive systems are to their advantage, right? So this is another part of the antinomy, right? The struggle, the contradiction, that when we promote freedom, unfortunately, some freedom gets denied. Our own is sacrificed, the oppressor's freedom to oppress, and even some of the people who are, I guess, innocent victims of the oppression. Now, this reminds me a bit of, we didn't read any Gandhi. I'm thinking about posting I have a very short PDF file that's an excerpt from some of Gandhi's writings. But he says something that is, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's somewhat intuitive. But then if you look to the Malcolm X reading that I posted, he says something that's the exact opposite. And when he says it, it also kind of sounds intuitive. What am I talking about? Well, Gandhi wrote something like, he said that if I'm being beaten, if somebody's trying to beat me with a stick to do something I don't want to do, he says that if I yield to that and I try to, then I've lost, right? If I don't yield, then that man will start to respect me, right? That I'll gain his respect. He'll start feeling bad about being such a dick, I guess. And he'll see that, like, no matter how mean he is to me, I stand there and I'm not willing to budge on my core beliefs, that this will gain respect for me. But the Malcolm X reading sort of implies the opposite. He says, if I'm in a corner and I'm being beaten down, I need to stand up for myself, because otherwise I won't be respected. I'll be trampled all over. And I hate to say it, but I think there's kind of something to both of those, I think. But I don't know. I kind of lean more towards Malcolm X, maybe because I grew up in a, San Antonio, in a kind of not super rough neighborhood, but a rougher neighborhood. I'm kind of thinking of like Schoolyard Politics. I know a lot of you, or most of you, are younger generation, and you probably were raised with a lot more adult supervision than I was. I was a child of the 80s, and so I was sort of a free-range child, one of the last of my kind, before stranger danger infected society and helicopter parenting was, spread out throughout our culture. But so maybe I'm just thinking of sort of schoolyard politics, and I'm thinking, if the bully asked you to give him your lunch money every day, and you just sort of, "Oh, so here you go," you're going to keep getting your lunch money stolen, right? I mean, the only chance you got is to stick up for yourself, and say, "No, you're going to have to beat me up for it," or something. And then maybe the bully will respect you or leave you alone, right? You got to sort of, I feel like I'm giving horrible advice here. Maybe this is a horrible analogy, but this is kind of what
it makes sense in lots of different contexts. If you're I forget the name of it, but if you're in Japan and you feel as though, you're going to disgrace your family, if you kill yourself, you're held upon a pedestal, right? That's the right thing to do. If you come over here and you're Catholic, you're going to hell, right? I just think that it's like the frame of reference that you put it in, like kind of, it's a cultural thing, kind of like you talk about, um, you know, like World War II is a really good example of when, you have to sacrifice these things for a small time to get to the greater good, right? But that was like a blip in history compared to some countries that have literally been at war for generations. Like they don't know any different. Their kids, their grandkids, like, you've got 4, 5, 6 generations, they've never known any different. So to tell them to sacrifice the greater good, or sacrifice this period of time, because we're going to get to the greater good, they've never known that. So I think it's just sometimes like a contextual concept, right? Like where you put that in reference to what you're looking at, whether it's a society, a country, a culture, a religion, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think to me, that's sort of the answer, if there is one, to this sort of, to resolve this issue. Because I think that, like in Gandhi's case, right, when he's making this argument, you got to understand, like, what situation historically is he dealing with, right? He's dealing with the colonial, British, right? The British rule over India, and he's standing up to that. So maybe, as you put it, you're using Japan as a sort of example. Perhaps the British culture was primed. They were culturally primed to respond in that way, right? And so as they were oppressing and beating down the Indian people, and I guess technically like the Pakistan, because Nepal and all that used to be all India, right, before the liberation. But anyway, they had their sort of Christian values, and so it kind of worked on them. It's sort of like it took a while, but they were publicly shamed. Once the newspaper started printing some of the violent events and all the horrible oppression that was going on in India, it made them ashamed of themselves, and it kind of forced them to be like, yeah, that's not right what we did, and it led to the treaty and this independence of India. So I think that his nonviolent stance did, maybe you could argue that it was effective because of who his opponent was. But I'm trying to imagine, like, could there have been in World War II, like in Nazi Germany, could there have been a Jewish Gandhi? Would that have worked if there was a nonviolent, someone who tried to stand up to Hitler and the Nazis but didn't want to fight them with any war machines, just by embarrassing them? I don't think it would have worked. No, because they had their ideology was like, you're just Jewish, so you don't even matter, right? I mean, and to be fair, I think the Brits kind of thought the same way about the dark-skinned people in India. They thought they were lower, but I think through time, and maybe that would be the argument. Gandhi might use that against my example. Well, the Jewish Gandhi would work, but it would just take longer, right? World War II was, but I would say, well, hell, World War II was long enough, right? It's like, in fact, that reminds me of a quote that from the reading that Malcolm X is trying to debate. What is it? Justice. How does it go? Justice postponed is justice delayed is no justice at all, or something like that. I forgot the exact quote, but yeah, I would say, okay, well, maybe I still am kind of skeptical. I don't know if a Jewish Gandhi would have worked against Hitler. They would just run him over with tanks, and laughed at while they did it or something. So I don't, but maybe well, it would have taken time. The German people would have seen this and felt ashamed of themselves and their own inhumanity, and this conscience in them would have risen up, and eventually this satyagraha, the Hindu word which means the power of nonviolence, would have shown through, and they would have changed their ways. It would have maybe taken longer, but we wouldn't have had blood on our hands. We wouldn't have had to kill any of them. But again, I think that's somewhat naive. I really do. I mean, and I hate to say that, because I mean, I don't know enough about Gandhi, like to really have an opinion. But MLK is like my hero. Like, he's one of my favorite human beings. Like, I get emotional talking about him. But I still also kind of think that if I was a black man in the 60s, uh, I probably would have joined up with Malcolm X over MLK. I think I would have, Um, so I just, maybe I'm more of a, maybe I'm a violent type. Maybe it's my Texas blood running through me. Like, I'm just, but to me, I mean, and maybe that's one thing that's why I get emotional and why I admire MLK so much, because I feel like what he did required such what's the word I'm looking for? Endurance. There was an interview with, I'm not a big fan of hers, but Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, it was a while ago. It was like right after she got out of office, right after the Bush administration. So this is like well over 10 years ago. She was talking, she just written a book, like a autobiography or something, memoirs. And she was talking about both her parents were professors, I think, at Howard University at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. So if you don't know, Howard University is like one of the most important, oldest Black universities in the country. It's where MLK is buried and where he went. But anyway, Condoleezza Rice, her dad, I think, and her mom, I think they both were professors at Howard. And neither one of them participated in the protests. None of them participated in the sit-ins or any of that. And it really angered her. She didn't like it as a youth. She was politically active. She was involved in them. She had to kind of hide that from her parents. And she was like, Dad, don't you support them? What the hell? And he told her, look, Condi, sweetie, yes, I support them 100% wholeheartedly. That's why I don't tell on any of my students for skipping class to take part in the demonstrations. I don't report them to the dean like the dean told me to. I got their back. But I ain't going to those demonstrations because there'll be hell's gonna freeze over before some cop punches me and I don't punch back. Hell's gonna freeze over before somebody squirts me with water and I don't shoot back. I just don't have it in me. I'm sorry. I respect that, but I'm human, and I'm gonna not be nonviolent, so I can't do it. And so maybe that's part of me. Like that's part of my admiration for King and being such a, I mean, beautiful human being. Despite, I'm sure, maybe not the most faithful to his wife, not a perfect human being, but what he did, just to me, larger than life, just amazing. And I just can't grasp it, like, my goodness, like I probably couldn't have done it with such poise as he did. On the other hand, too, like, I think, to go back to what you were saying, Andres, is that it seems like these two tactics, violence, nonviolence, it really depends on what culture, what historical situation, what context that you're referring to. I've had some students, older students, older than me, much older than me, who lived through this era, through the civil rights movement. A lot of older Black students, mainly women, who are very vocal about this. They almost always agree that it wouldn't have worked without both. Is that you kind of had to have both. I hate to use this analogy, but it's sort of like a good cop, bad cop kind of situation, right? I guess like Malcolm X is the bad cop, MLK is the good cop. I don't know, kind of thing. Sort of like, for most Americans, Malcolm X was just too much, right? But he represented a justifiable anger against an unjust society. And so I think that for some people, they needed that outlet, and maybe that shock made MLK less shocking, right? Because MLK was seen as, and to sort of try to draw more from the actual readings that we're doing, this is what he's trying to respond to in his letter from a Birmingham jail, right? King is responding to critics who are saying he's a radical, right? That he's asking for too much too soon. And so he lays out that, no, I'm being absolutely reasonable. I understand that I'm annoying. He compares himself to Socrates and uses that metaphor of the gadfly. If you've ever read the Apology, when Socrates is on trial, he says, I know I'm a gadfly. I know that I'm annoying. I'm like that little fly that stings a horse's rear end. And the horse swats it and just comes right back and keeps stinging. But I'm trying to wake up this noble but sluggish steed, right? Athens. And King, Martin Luther King, he likens himself to that, like Socrates trying to, bring his fellow countrymen to the heights of intellectual speculation and the contemplation of universal truths about justice and humanity. He is trying to get a government to live up to its own ideals. And in order to do that, he has to create a sort of tension. He calls it a creative tension in the community. Because if you don't do that, then negotiations are sort of on bad faith. They're on bad faith. The idea is, he negotiated with city leaders. They said they were going to remove segregation signs. They didn't. So he started the protest. He started the wall. He started the sit-ins. The bus boycotts. People got angry with him, got really upset. But he said, "Yeah, you didn't listen to me the first time." And the famous quote, right? Freedom is never given willfully by those who are oppressing. It has to be demanded by those that are oppressed.
But don't you think it was a necessary evil? Like, it wasn't a matter of one being better than the other. I think it was feeding kind of all of the souls that were participating in that. Martin Luther King was devout in his faith, and I think that it gave people hope, right? Everybody, we all liked it, whether you like vanilla, chocolate, ice cream, whatever, we all like ice cream. So I think that, the two, MLK and Malcolm X, they were necessary, to make a point. And I think it fed different parts of that movement, but it still combined. They were just looking for any forward momentum, and they were fighting a really tough battle. I mean, it was kind of the necessary thing, so you had Martin Luther King, who was, trying to be consistent, and he was trying to, create the tension so that the movement still had forward momentum, and he gave a lot of people faith, and it gave them hope. And then you had kind of the violent uprising of Malcolm X, who said, when that's not enough, we're going to still move forward. So, I mean, I think I respect them both for very different things that were necessary, because, I mean, change needed to happen, and they were making that happen in different ways, but it was still, happening for all.
Right. I think, I think you make a good point that what they provided, I guess, for those who were oppressed was different, right? And so maybe some needed more of one than the other. And so it's good that you had both. So, like you mentioned, hope. Martin Luther King Jr. offers this vision of hope, dignity, camaraderie with all humanity, this vision of the future. Whereas I think with Malcolm X, one of the keys that is so important that he brought to the community of those that were marginalized was a sense of dignity, self-responsibility, autonomy, right? Being able to take control of your life and not being the victim of blind forces or political powers that you had no say-so in. And so I think that to do that, it may be brutal, especially to the regime in charge, right? But like you said, perhaps this is some sort of necessary evil.
What was the school where they sent those little kids in? It was the first time they integrated a school, and there's photos of police officers with the German shepherds, and here are these little kids.
Oh geez, what the heck? Now you had to ask. The painting is by Norman Rockwell. There's a painting,
right? Of the actual photo here. You have these little. I mean, they are just. I mean, they're not babies, but to me, they're like little kids.
Yeah, they're like 4 or 5 year olds, like tiny.
I mean, as a parent, if you have kids or whatever, you can't tell me that Martin Luther King didn't feed some kind of, hope and faith that as you sent your child down that sidewalk, with these people that you knew didn't have that kid's best interests, right, at heart. Like, you had to have some kind of faith, and so I think that they were necessary, it was the same concept, a different idea of how to get from point A to point B. But I mean, to look at Martin Luther King, who's saying, look, we have to do this. We're going to hope, we're going to pray, we're going to keep moving forward. Like if that's your little kid walking down, just to put yourself in the moment, you had to have something, right? That was going to give you the motivation and drive to keep moving forward. And so maybe on different levels, there were, reasons that we needed them both.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I guess we didn't spend a whole lot of time in this class, this ethics course, talking about. I guess there's a short video on the relation between religion and ethics and this or that, and it's been a while since I watched or gave that lecture, so I don't remember how deep we got into it. But I feel like I probably focused more on the negative aspects than the positive ones. And I think, I'm not a religious person myself, but I find it kind of annoying when I meet fellow atheists or non-believers who have a very sort of flippant, kind of disrespectful, almost antagonistic view towards all religious sentiment whatsoever, and they just sort of spit on it like, you're religious. But to me, it's like, that's naive, because I really don't think you could imagine a Martin Luther King without his Christianity. And I think that allowed him to not just give hope, as you said, to other people, but I think I gave him a sense of purpose and a sense of, I can't read the guy's mind, but you hear his speeches and they're obviously inspired a lot of them by scripture. He uses a lot of references, a lot of, quotes and stuff, and rhetoric and sayings and stuff from the Bible. And so I think, his spirituality, I can't imagine it's separate from him. And I think that inspired him to do such a good thing. And if that's what worked, I'm kind of thinking of it in a pragmatic sense. Like, even though I personally might not believe that faith, I'm not like an adherent to that doctrine, I see the practical necessity of it, right? That it gave him a sense of not just dignity, but also a sort of care and love for humanity, right? Seeing a brotherhood of humanity and a hope that there could be a future where a lot of this tension was resolved. And I think with that,
religion in this instance is just, one of the avenues. I think anything that you find that drive or that hope in, for instance, just a funny story, like I grew up in a very fundamental religion. So we didn't believe in cutting our hair or wearing makeup, or we spent a lot of time in church when I was growing up. Holy cow, right? I had sisters, we only wore dresses, right? We never wore pants, right? So as an adult, making my own choice, I wouldn't consider myself very religious at all. But whatever the avenue is that gives you the good intent. I took a religious class, but it's been a while. So what is the one religion? Is it Buddhism or that basically says, what you give out good is going to come back. So whatever your avenue is that gives you the good intent, right? Malcolm X, we may not have agreed with him, but for him, his drive and forward momentum wasn't found in religion, right? He had a different avenue, but same intent, right? So, I think whatever you use as your vehicle, that's kind of what people look to. And sometimes people are drawn to, whether it's a religion or whether it's, here you have the strong, powerful voice coming at you, whatever that is, it's the same, but different.
Right. Yeah. That's sort of I would say I pretty much agree with all you said. I would say, look, I don't care what your religious beliefs are. How do you live by them? Or do you live by them? How do they guide your behavior? If they guide you to do good things and they inspire you to do good things, and that's great. If they make you be insufferable and kind of just give you excuses for horrible behavior, or give you excuses to judge other people for stuff that's not your business, then I have issues with that, right? So it depends on, again, what are you doing here? How are you? But also, I got to correct you, though. Malcolm X was actually religious. He just wasn't Christian, right? He was a Muslim, and he had a bit of a religious what's the word? conversion, because he had originally, he lived his early life, he lived very irreligious. He was like a criminal pimp, drug dealer. Ended up in prison, and in prison met some people who were Muslim, and they taught him about the Muslim faith, and he took to it, but it was a very extreme form of Islam, the Nation of Islam, which is a black nationalist version of Islam, where they believe that the black people are actually the real Israelites, that it's all a big giant conspiracy, and the true Hebrews are actually black people, and it's very against black nationalism. So he was sort of like, black people need to separate, and he was actually pro segregation. He felt like in order for black people to be able to develop their own civilization and culture, they had to do it apart from white civilization. It wasn't until he actually took the Hajj to Mecca, right? The pilgrimage that all Muslims are supposed to take at least once during their lifetime. They go to Mecca to see the Kaaba and walk around the Kaaba and touch the cornerstone where Abraham apparently built the building or whatever. But when he went there, he saw all these white people and black people and brown people and from all walks of life just kind of chilling and treated as equals. They were all wearing the same clothing. They were all sort of, drinking from the same cups. And that changed his view. And so when he came back to the United States after that, he left the Nation of Islam and started to preach a more inclusive view, but he got assassinated very shortly thereafter. Some think it was by the Nation of Islam. Others think the FBI or CIA were involved. I personally, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I think it was both. But anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked.
Who doesn't love like a good conspiracy theory, though?
What's that?
But I guess who doesn't love a good conspiracy theory? Yeah. But I mean, when I think of like Western culture, religion, that very much framed Martin Luther King, and it framed his message,
right?
In a much different, way that we would view religion when you look at Malcolm X.
Yeah,
I mean, he was comparatively, they were.
I think though, because his form of religion was so politically explicit, like it was almost like a political ideology more than it was like a spiritual ideology. But I think it served him well. Like a lot of my friends who, when I tell them how much I admire Malcolm X, they'll be like, but he was kind of racist. Like he hated white people. I'm like, well, one, he changed his mind at the end. He converted. And two, can you blame him for hating white people? Like given the life he led, right? Like, I mean, given the experiences that he had, I don't begrudge him that. Maybe he could have been more open-minded, but given all the experiences of white people that he had in his life up to that point, I can see why he formed that perspective of them. I don't hold that against him, and in a way, I remember even as a kid, when I first learned about, I think I was in third grade, and they were teaching us about Marcus Garvey. I don't know if you know who Marcus Garvey was, but he was this black man in the maybe the late 1800s, early 1900s. I can't remember when he was alive, but he was one of the first very outspoken black nationalists. And he actually, I think they wanted to arrest him, but he fled to Jamaica, and he was a black supremacist. He thought that the black man was beautiful and white man was ugly. And everybody was like, oh, what a bad person he was. He was really weird and he was crazy. And as a little kid, even in third grade, I was kind of like, that dude's kind of cool, man. Like, even though he saw me, he'd be like, that white man's inferior or whatever. Like, to me, like the audacity, to be that confident in yourself, like even though society, the whole world is telling you that you're lesser, that you're not good enough, that you're inferior, like despite all, you're like, screw you, I'm better than everybody else, I'm like that shows a sort of confidence and tenacity, and like good for him, man. Marcus Garvey's kind of a badass, and I kind of feel the same way about Malcolm X. I'm like, I don't begrudge him his hatred of the white man. I'm like, well, yeah, You know, and again, he was not so dogmatic. You know, he let his life experiences shape him. So when he did go to Mecca and he interacted with these white people, he's like, well, I was wrong, you know, and he learned from that. So he wasn't so like rigid. So I think that's kind of why I forgive him his rhetoric, you know, against white people and all that stuff. And besides, even before he went to Mecca, he even said it in one of his. And actually, this is in the reading that I gave y'all, where he talks about, I don't begrudge. I wouldn't begrudge white people if they were using violence against us, if we did the same thing to them, if we were oppressing them, if we were backing them into a corner, if we weren't, then I would expect them to fight us back. So, I think that's, he's pretty honest and kind of fair, I think, about it, even when he was still the more militant figure.
But I think that's really like the greater concept is to see a person who can grow and a person who is honest about what those thoughts are. I think the greatest challenge that we face today is just understanding that as humans we're flawed, and that sometimes, I mean, Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, he was a flawed human. Okay. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of the beast, right? But I think that, to see a person who can kind of grow and evolve, that's a greater, I think that's like the bigger picture, the more important part of the picture. So, I mean, I think that I don't always agree with everything that's said. Like, when you have Malcolm X, he was very kind of extreme sometimes, but I think that I respect the idea where he came from. And I think that perspective is important.
Yeah, and something you said kind of reminds me, I guess this is maybe the same point or a similar point. Oh shit, I lost it. What were you just saying? You're talking about Malcolm X. Oh yeah, there's this idea of learning, right? Of kind of evolving. There's a pretty interesting article by a woman named Susan Wolf, who I think she's still teaching at I think UNC in North Carolina. I'm not sure that's where she's at, but she published an article, I think in the late 80s, called Moral Saints. And she kind of talks about kind of what you were saying there. She almost says, like, we can only put up with so much perfection. In fact, we kind of like it when our heroes are a little human, right? That's kind of like why we like MLK, because he's human. Like, we see him struggling. We know that he wasn't a perfect, he cheated on his wife, right? Like he wasn't, but again, he was a human being. He was flawed. It was almost like there's something that kind of disgusts us about people that are perfect. Like we can only take so much goodness, right? And so, like, for her, it's like, they got to be a little bit flawed, because I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Maybe this is outdated, but I'm thinking of like the Star Wars movies. I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, but I mean, I like I said, I was a child of the 80s, so obviously I watched Star Wars. But like the character of Han Solo, I think, is kind of a good example of, like, he's kind of this gruff guy who, like, he's a bounty hunter, like he just does stuff for money, but he always does the right thing in the end. Like he ends up doing the right thing, kind of like against his like wishes. He's like, I guess I'll go save Princess Leia. It's the right thing to do, Whereas like Luke Skywalker is this sort of like naive, like, oh, I'm just good, I do the right thing all the time. It's like he's like this perfect, goody two shoes, who, it's like, I don't know. I mean, there's something that kind of is not as charismatic or intriguing about that. I don't know what if there's much to that.
I was gonna say that also, if a person's more like relatable, like if you can't relate anything to them, it's not gonna make their message as strong. That's it. Thank you.
Definitely a good point. Yeah, for sure. Did I have my mute on? Okay, cool. Yeah, that's definitely a good point, right? I think, and maybe that kind of goes back to something you were saying earlier, Andrea, about how maybe we did need both figures MLK and Malcolm X. I don't want to make it seem like they were the only two people in the civil rights movement, but obviously they're the ones we're talking about. But you needed these two types because maybe there's some people that could relate more to an MLK than they could to Malcolm X, or vice versa. Honestly, though, I think that both of them are a lot more relatable than Luke Skywalker. You know, it's just like, yeah, there's a name for that in literature. I don't know what the male name is, but I think the female is a Mary Sue. Like that's what they call it. It's a Mary Sue character. I might have that wrong, but that's like what you call someone. Like they're a perfect character. It's seen as like a sign of bad writing. Like you're not really developing. Like the character has no flaws. They're perfect. They never make mistakes, and it's kind of off-putting. The reader can't relate. They seem like almost robotic. That sort of thing. And maybe too, again, to bring it back to ethics, our moral sentiments are kind of almost offended by that type of character. You know, it to me it almost seems disingenuous too, right? It's either naive, like the Luke Skywalker type, who's just like, oh, I'm just a good boy because I want to be good, oh, you know, that sort of just naive thing, or it's kind of like either that, or it's just like they're just being good because they want the they want to, they're just, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. It's sort of like they just want to be patted on the back, you know. It's like virtue signaling. It's like, see, aren't I good? Aren't I a good person? Why don't you like show? You know, it's like, whereas like Han Solo, you know, when he does the right thing, you know, he's doing it because he knows it's the right thing, even though he's like, well, I have this desire to be a selfish bastard, just like all of us do, but I'm gonna resist that to be a good guy, right? Whereas it's like this, oh, I'll just do the right thing. It's like this kid is just like, he doesn't even realize like the options he's got. And there's, you know, I don't know. I feel like I've belabored that point enough, but anyway. Well, it's only like an hour and 15 minutes in, but I feel like we've kind of exhausted this discussion here. No one else has talked except for me and Andrea. Oh, I guess Desiree chimed in for a little bit, but does anybody, T or Bipolar, you have anything you want to add, or any comments, questions, concerns? How about this? What do you think? If you had to pick, I'll kind of do a quick poll here. If you got to pick one or the other, you can't be like me and Andrea and do this compromise where, oh, they're both good and you need them both. If you had to pick, you had to go with either MLK and Gandhi, I guess, or Malcolm X and Simone de Beauvoir. Which would you go with? Would you go with the nonviolence, the MLK and the Gandhi, or would you go with the Malcolm X and the Simone de Beauvoir, the any means necessary?
Professor, I think I would go with the Gandhi's philosophy.
Cool. So the nonviolence. All right. Anybody else? What else? What Desiree, what do you think? You would Gandhi?
I would go with like Malcolm X.
Yeah.
I just feel like some like letting people walk over you for a minute. It's just, I feel like you get to your answers and conclusions faster if you're going with violence, because they have to acknowledge you at that point.
Yeah, and that's what he says, and I kind of agree with him. Again, I think, you know, what like Andrea was saying earlier, it's like maybe it depends on the context, right? Like to some people, that violence is the only thing they're gonna respect, you know, and for some of them, they'll just use the violence against you. See, I told you they were bad. Look what they did, you know. But they're never gonna come to your side anyway. So, yeah, I'm kind of, so it looks like we got one for nonviolence. We got one for violence if you have to. I'm going to kind of be with Desiree and agree with her. What else?
I would have to go with Malcolm.
Malcolm, okay,
Right.
Wow. So it looks like Malcolm's winning out. T is at work. Bipole, would you want to say something?
Yeah. I was trying to say something. I mean, if you have like, you're going to allow this conversation a little longer?
Yeah, of course.
Longer?
Yeah,
okay,
of course.
Okay. So actually, the comment I wanted to give here was like as you said, like the Gandhi's philosophy, which was non-violence. I think it says it's a matter of perspective and time, and time is the most important thing here, because like it's depending on like which time zone, I mean, which I mean, uh, uh, I'm saying like the time, I mean, the era, which era you living in. Depending on that, like you gotta take the decision, like, and what kind of people you're dealing with. Based on that, like you have to see like what kind of to stop violence, or like to stop oppressions on the people, innocent people. Like you gotta take the decision if it's non-violence or violence, which should be more proper here. And the other thing I wanted to, like, as you mentioned earlier, that like how British people went to India and tried to rule Indian people. So actually, I'm from that part of the world. So actually, I haven't read too much on those things, but I have some kind of understanding, or like or whatever I have seen around me, and my like cultural thing. So the thing is, like, I think uh, uh, on that scenario in India, people was like mostly emotional driven people. Or on the other hand, like if you say the Western culture, Western part of the world, they are most likely to be the logical, like logic driven people. Like they whatever, I mean, they're like rapidly growing towards like I would say like modernized society. And also like they're like trying to be more like uh I would say like more and more like technological, and like and everything. So on every aspects they're like progressing very rapidly. On the other hand, the Indian people, or like if you talk about those part of the world, that part of the world, they're not like that much up to date by that time. So it was easy to like manipulate their thoughts and everything. So that on that perspective, like when Gandhi took the like approach of non-violence towards that issue, because I think it was kind of impossible to uh, fight those people who are like trying to logically oppress those people, like Indian people. So I think that was the decision, or that was the step he took against that issue. And
Yeah. Go ahead.
and the other thing you said, like the Hitler and Jewish people, I think there was also a different kind of perspective here, because they're like kind of like, I think they're kind of like they don't like the really, they're like kind of religiously like they're like opposing those certain amount of people, like really like based on religion. So on the other hand, like the Gandhi issue, that was kind of like not religiously hatred, but it was kind of a little bit different, I would say.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I think, yeah. So there's a lot you just said there. So let me try to respond to it all.
I'm so sorry
Yeah.
about like
No, it's all right. It's all right. I want to make sure I get it all, respond to all of it. So let's see. Yeah, and I think you're kind of just touching on things we've already discussed, but let's kind of return to them briefly. Yeah, so I think the point about you've got, in a way though, I don't know if you're making that strong an argument, because it's like, okay, well, if Gandhi had to use the courts, or if he had to use nonviolence, because one of the reasons you sort of seem to be implying is that there was a sort of power imbalance, obviously, but not just a power imbalance, like, in a general sense, but a technological sense. And so he sort of saw this as the way to go forward. There's no way you're going to beat the British in a physical, kinetic warfare. So
because logically they are perfect. Logically, British people were like, they didn't do any wrong against anybody because they are going by the logical.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure this is what you're saying, but I get what they're going to think is, at least this is how they're going to justify to themselves, is that we're bringing all this progress to India, so they should be thankful for us, right? Like, they should be thankful. And there's some, I mean, I've met a lot of Indians that actually feel that way. They're like, well, yes, it was oppressive, but we got all this whatever stuff, so it was worth it, kind of thing. But I still feel like, yeah, well, maybe couldn't you have got that without the exploitation, without the, couldn't have the Brits just been nice and been like, hey, let's do some trading and we'll show you some of our secrets if you trade with us some of your goods and all that. But they'll be asking too much. But what you said about the Nazis too is interesting, is that there was a more religious element to that antagonism, whereas with the Brits, it was more like, well, we just have our empire and we're expanding. And we're trying to get as much out of the world as we can. It's for the glory of Britain. Whereas the Nazis, they were using a sort of ideology of nation state, of, the German country is going to be reborn, and the Jews were seen as this evil, enemy in the way. And it was, and the Jewish people had their faith. And so I think there was a more spiritual, and there's no way to sort of penetrate that. Whereas I think maybe the Brits could think more like you said, I hate to use the word logical, but I know what you mean, right? That they can be more reasoned with, I guess, than the Nazis would have, right? We saw that with the what was the Warsaw Pact that Hitler violated, for sure, right? So I think, kind of to come back to your first point, I think this was your first point, was that it is sort of dependent upon context, and perhaps violence might be the only way out in some situations, whereas maybe you're saying like in India it was more appropriate what Gandhi did. Although, and you might know more about this than you probably do know more about this than I do, being from that part of the world. From my understanding though, Gandhi kind of, even though he's a national hero, he kind of gets too much credit, especially outside of India, because that's the only person we know of. But there were a lot of other people involved, and some of them weren't nonviolent. Like, there were actual groups who were trying to fight the Brits with weapons and stuff. They weren't, and some argue that if it weren't for those groups, kind of the same point that me and Andrea were making earlier, that it wasn't just Gandhi, but it was also some of the other groups that kind of moved things along.
Definitely.
And I've also heard this, and I'm not a Gandhi scholar. I've only read maybe like 30 or 40 pages of his writings, but I was watching a lecture on him years ago, and one of the guys that was giving the lecture was kind of explaining that it's a mischaracterization to say that he was completely against any violence. He was against using violence to get your way. He was against but if you were defending your family, like self-defense, like he was that was fine. There
are a lot of stuffs about Gandhi you can question, like you can literally say that he didn't do right on those topics. But like as I know, the background of Gandhi was kind of like, he was a general, a normal, citizen of India. So the beginning of this kind of approach was started first when he was like going somewhere with he was going somewhere by train, and then he went to the first class compartment, and then for some reason he was kicked out of the compartment because he wasn't a white person.
Skin. Right. That was when he was practicing law in South Africa, and that's when he started to decide, I need to stop this. And people give him criticisms during that time period because he felt that he was superior to the black skinned people. He thought that so there's a lot of people today that are like, oh, he was racist against black people. But when he got older, he changed his ways. I think when he was this is when he was in his 20s practicing law in South Africa, and he felt that Indians should be treated the same as the white people, but the black people should still be lower class citizens. But when he became the Mahatma And I think by the time he was in his 40s, he had realized that was bad for him to think that way. So. Another example of somebody being shaped by their experiences and being willing to admit that they're wrong, which is one reason I admire him and Malcolm X. But anyway, I guess that's a good place to stop, unless you wanted to add something else. Anybody?
No, sure.
That's it. All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording. If y'all want to stick